Luke Sewell, welcome to the Pacey Performance Podcast. Pleasure to have you.
Yeah, thanks for being here. It's a pleasure.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for coming on. We had a little bit of a chat earlier. You've got a bit of a different background to the traditional
Yeah,
S&C physio rehab that we normally have on the podcast.
yeah. It's a bit alternative. Yeah, so my background was in gymnastics. I started gymnastics when I was about four. Acrobatic gymnastics, not your traditional um, Olympic style gymnastics you'd see on telly. So yeah, started when I was four. Ended up getting quite good. Competed internationally when I was about seven. Ended up trialing and being involved with the GB squad for about 4 years. Um, so winning gold and silver medals at European and World Championships. And unfortunately, like it sounds a bit cliche, but I retired due to injury. Uh, and I always knew I wanted to work in sport, so I went to university at the University of the West of England in Bristol, and trained or I did my degree in sports rehab. And so I made some good contacts and did some good work experience at Cheltenham Town and Bristol City. Made some good contacts there. Andy Rolls is a big mentor of mine, Andy Proctor. So they really sort of helped me along my journey. Moved over to Ipswich, and I've been here for 3.5 years. Been lucky enough to see the back-to-back promotions to the Premier League, and I'm now currently supporting Ipswich Town first team, predominantly doing their sort of outside rehab and reconditioning, and yeah, so just trying to be of benefit and do the best I can, really.
I'm sure you are, mate. So there's someone based inside as well, and you're the outside guy?
Yeah,
Is
so
that how you work it?
we've got a rehab team. So it consists of myself doing the outside work. We've got two rehab physios, James Heaton and Dan Morton, and a S&C or two S&Cs. We've got Ivan McCandy and Dan Peacock. I think you know Ivan. So that's our team, and so any first teamer that sort of comes through the door, we pick up and um and work with in our team, really.
Give us
Sort
a
of
bit
goes
of
through
an
each one of us. Yeah,
give us a bit of a insight into that flow
yeah,
of
yeah, yeah.
how that works.
Yeah, so initially, I mean, in the acute stages, sort of Matt Byard, the head physio, will assess and will then sort of collaborate really um, upon sort of timeframes and when we think what is appropriate for return. The rehab physios pick them up initially, take them through all their sort of acute and mid-stage stuff in the gym, and then when it comes to, I mean, the end stage work, I take them exclusively and I work with them exclusively on the pitch until return to performance, really.
Nice. So what we're going to get into today is the hamstring
Mm.
framework that you've developed. Is that a you thing or is that a team thing?
No, it's a team thing. It's
Okay.
been developing over the last sort of 3.5 years, really, and it's
Okay.
still developing. But
Yeah,
yeah,
and you're going to write an article. You're in the process of writing an article with Sportsmith on this, which is where we've kind of based this
yeah.
discussion. Has anyone else had an input into that article?
No one's had input.
Yeah.
We've obviously, like I said, we've developed the framework. I mean, over the last 3 years, so we've all been involved in it, and with the stuff that it involves. But yeah, no,
Nice. So the whole, I suppose, the point of the article and the focus of the discussion is this thought of being a bit more aggressive
yeah,
with hamstring injury rehab.
yeah.
So give us some where the inspiration came from. Why the thinking behind doing
I,
something like this?
I think I think within a first team environment, um, well, sort of our experience, we were really trying to push last season I mean, to achieve promotion, which was obviously massive for the club, massive for the players, um, and I think if we can return players quicker, we give the team the best opportunity to perform. I think player availability is a massive factor. Like player availability does essentially win games. If you have your best players available, you're gonna essentially do better and win crucial games. So we had a couple of players out towards the end of the season, and we got together and we thought, okay, well, how can we really push this rehab safely, effectively, um, and and do the best we can to return them in line for the last games of the season, really.
So what were the key risks? What are the key risks for doing something like this? And obviously, the rewards are pretty obvious.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
any key risks? Obviously, the risk is re-injury, but anything around that?
Yeah, I think it is. I think it is re-injury is the main one, sort of breakdown. Um, in theory, I think it's important to define what sort of pushing the rehab process is, or accelerating the rehab process as people may see it. It sounds really controversial, and I can imagine that sort of people listening to this will think you can't accelerate a time frame. Like a time frame's a time frame. Um, but in essence, it's not breaking time frames and breaking rules on sort of from a tissue healing perspective. It's more, okay, where's the player at this point in time? Can we achieve this objective marker at maybe an earlier point in time, and if he can achieve that, okay, we can progress to the next objective marker a little bit sooner, and then that cascade follows. Of course, it should be objectively driven, which keeps it safe and effective. But in theory, yeah, going back to your question, there shouldn't really be any risks other than the classic sort of breakdown or re-injury, and that shouldn't occur unless collaboration and everyone's got a collective understanding of where we stand, what the aim is, and what are the steps at each stage in order for us to progress safely and effectively.
Like you say, I suppose when you say that to someone about being more aggressive,
Yeah,
the tissue healing will be the one that, like, you can't accelerate that, and that's
yeah,
you're obviously accepting of that,
yeah,
but
yeah.
you're trying to drag other things up alongside that natural healing process to then
Yeah,
therefore progress.
yeah. Like the ultimately, players are going to heal at their own rate. Like you said, you can't change that sort of tissue healing cascade and the principles that go along with it. Um, all you can do is throw things at the player to help positively influence that cascade and essentially see if they respond in a positive way, really.
Would there be any scenario where it's not appropriate? Any particular player, previous injury, any tick boxes that you would go through to go, okay, we can push this guy or we can't push this guy?
Yeah, I think in relation to sort of grading, sort of muscle injury grading, the BAMIT classification is currently the most recognised. Well, within sort of
And what's the
English
BAMIC?
football, the British Athletic Muscle Injury Classification.
Yep.
Um, so that essentially you're attaching a number and a suffix together to essentially create a graded muscle injury. That might be like a 2B or a 2C. The 2 relates to there's the fiber disruption essentially, or the severity, and the C or the character relates to the location. So there are times where you think actually this guy can't progress, and uh, Professor Faris Haddad speaks of it quite well. He did a podcast. Was it the FA Medical Society podcast? Um, and he basically discusses how there are some injuries that he's more worried about. Professor Faristad's a surgeon, a well-known surgeon, hamstring surgeon. Uh, Essentially, he talks about how there are some injuries that he's really worried about and some injuries that he's not so worried about in relation to location and severity. And so I think it's about initially understanding the injury you've got. I think that's a massive factor. Really, okay, once an injury's occurred, just sort of break it down and understand, is this an injury that we can potentially push harder in relation to the clinical findings and the anatomy, and so really understanding that, and then you can sort of go on with your team to collaborate and push on, really.
Just bringing this kind of definition of pushing harder to life a little bit more, and just to kind of solidify it for people that are listening, give us 2 scenarios, if you possibly could, of where you have pushed it.
Okay.
And what would maybe be more traditional route to get somewhere, just to give us an idea of the contrast.
Okay, it's a good question. So, yeah, I mean, we've probably had hamstring injuries whereby there's a significant disruption to the distal bicep femoris, with loss of tension of the tendon, and that's one where we've actually thought, okay, it's got loss of tension, but the loss of tension is very minor. Where the anatomy actually inserts, there's minimal gapping on the MRI, so we think actually it's still attached. There's a little bit of tendon disruption, but it's still attached, and the fiber disruption is minimal. So this is an injury that we actually can progress a little bit quicker, and see what we can achieve by exposing the player to things a little bit earlier, and just sort of gaining some information that way. In contrast, we've had sort of players where they've had a proximal avulsion, whereby the gapping obviously is, well, there's no tendon at the top, so that's one we know is a surgical case for sure, and that's going to have to be protocol driven, and that's one that we can't really progress. So I think it's knowing, it's knowing what's in front of you. I think there's also an element of it's not just a scan element. It's a classification. It's knowing what's the motivation for the athlete and the club. At what point in the season are we? And sort of taking everything within the situation on board to really decide, okay, is it which pathway we're going to follow?
For that first example, if you were going to go if you're going to go more aggressive, what, in terms of programming your stuff on the field, what would a more aggressive approach look like versus more traditional? Are you going? Yeah, over to you.
Yeah, I mean, within the early stages, it's self-explanatory, isn't it? It's you're trying to remove any fluid, remove any swelling, remove any blood that's sat within the muscle that doesn't need to be there. Use your peace and love protocol. Throw the kitchen sink at it in terms of an acute phase. From there, I think you can start to load it early, and mainly from a neuromuscular standpoint, just trying to regain some control, and some proprioception back through the muscle. You're I think it's exposure to load. Hamstrings and muscles are designed to be loaded. So trying to gauge where the player's at in terms of a strength deficit and a control deficit perspective early is sort of your next protocol.
Perfect. Just moving on to I suppose, the stakeholders that are involved in this, the player being one, medical staff, you guys, coaches, head coach, the club itself. And you mentioned that there's so many factors that go into the decision making of how quickly to progress this time of the season, etc.
Yeah.
How do you communicate with the player?
Mm.
And how do you bring him, or if there's people working with girls out there, how do you bring them involved, get them involved in this process to communicate that, look, we're going to accelerate this a little bit quicker for these particular reasons. These are the reasons why. How do you navigate that?
Yeah, once again, it's a good question. It's really about, firstly, like I touched on, getting the team around you on board so that everyone's in alignment. If you're having people who, if you've got your team that are on different pages, who are going to tell the player one thing and someone else tells the player another thing, it's never going to end well. So, like I said, team in alignment, approaching the player and saying, look, even showing them pictures of a scan if you've got it, or drawing a picture, because that's an easy way for my brain to understand how things work. So I think a clear explanation of, okay, this is what you've got, this is how we're going to approach it. Maybe give them a clear plan. A clear plan's important, but also a rough time frame of, okay, this is, if we push this a little bit harder, we can actually achieve X for now, or Y for in 2 weeks, and Z for in 3 weeks. I think it's important to just be clear with your explanation, be clear with a plan, and just maintain a positive attitude, really, and just give them plenty of support, knowing that it will be okay. And as long as they achieve the objective markers that we've set, there's no reason why they can't achieve the end goal.
Has there been a scenario where you're ready to push, you think that the player's physically ready to push, but psychologically they're coming back with, I aren't sure about this, I'm not quite sure I'm where you think I am? Yeah. If so, how do you deal with that?
It's just reassurance. And not so much with hamstrings. Our hamstrings have been pretty plain sailing, just because of that objectivity. We know that we're securing their strength deficits or their power deficits, or whatever we've been prescribing. Maybe with an injury such as an MCL, which tend to be a little bit abrupt with the way they want to progress. And I think I think it's just reassurance, giving the player plenty of support and a strong sort of base for them to bounce off questions and it's just reassurance.
Perfect. On that objectivity that you've mentioned a couple of times, talk us through that process. What objective markers come in at what points, whether that's you or the rest of the team?
Yeah, so sort of in a brief breakdown, initially not so much objective, but pain, or subjective sort of reporting of pain from first in the acute stage. Sort of stage 2, we're starting to look at sort of maintaining control and a pushing isometric action in sort of long lever positions, trying to maintain neuromuscular control and time under tension for long periods. Moving then on to sort of higher force movements such as stronger hamstring pushes or sort of explosive actions. That will be, or sort of along with being able to hold in long lever positions, so you're holding isometric actions. We use a lot of the run specific isometrics, some of the Alex and Terra stuff, and it forms a big part of our framework. More specifically towards like the tail end of the spectrum, we want them to, and sort of pushing towards sprinting and max velocity, we want the players to be able to explosively produce max force, or in relation to their uninjured limb, within 100 milliseconds. That's a big marker for us.
And
So
how do you
we
how do you
know-
test that? How do you test that, Luke?
Yeah, so on the force decks, sort of hip iso push. So yeah, that's massive for us. And then pushing into sort of max velocity, we just want limb symmetry index to be nil. And yeah, that max force is probably key. So that we know that when sort of sprinting and the hamstrings are activated at their maximum, so we need to know that is replicated in the gym.
Do you do anything when the guys are sprinting and accelerating? Do you do any is there anything objective, or is it objective it can be around that in terms of video or anything like that?
Yeah, not so much when they're sprinting. We've started to use the CMAS, sort of tailoring towards change of direction and really trying to hone in on their mechanics. Not so much the CMAS in depth, but we are really starting to look at their kinematics of their change of direction, specifically sort of with knee injuries and ankle injuries.
Sorry, Luke. Do you get everyone to do that? So you've got baselines.
Yeah,
Stuff,
well, we have started to.
Okay.
It's a bit of a new process, so we are starting
okay.
collecting. Probably going to push for some sort of change of direction, sort of assessments in pre-season, just so we have got baselines for everyone. But no, I mean, I primarily use their maximal match outputs on the pitch. So the metrics that they've achieved within a game, their maximal match output, I would use that exclusively to program their rehab as a objective sort of marker for their return to sprint distance, obviously, and their max velocity.
One thing that I wanted to ask you was that return to high speed running and match intensity movements.
Yeah.
How do you integrate that, knowing the risks of if you're pushing this guy on a little bit quicker than maybe other practitioners maybe not comfortable with, but not be the norm? How do you do that safely?
So if we're really pushing, I get the athletes to start running at 100% of their maximal aerobic speed. This gives them it's a relatively high speed to, I guess, start running. Well, I mean, it changes for everyone, but it's their comfortable zone. They're used to running within that zone. That's their zone. And as the rehab progresses, they should move their way through their anaerobic speed reserve, at which point, when they're starting to introduce high-speed running, they should be at a point whereby they don't need to increase their velocity by very much to start accumulating high-speed running metrics. I mean, I try to keep them, or keep increments below 20%. This just gives me a nice buffer to progress and regress if I need to. But yeah, that's essentially what I'll do.
And you're using the match output, the percentage of the match outputs as a way to progress to 100% of match.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of practitioners use sort of weekly averages or maximum averages over for a return, which I think is great. Um, the way I tend to use or try to view using one single maximum match output is essentially it replicates their worst case scenario in essence. That's the highest output they've ever achieved in a game. So if you can program rehab to get them back to that intensity, that match intensity, you are essentially prepping them for that biggest game they've ever competed in.
And is that a time period? Is that like the top 5 minutes or top 10 minutes and you replicate that?
Yeah, no, so I mean, it's mainly metric. So if, say, we played a game at the start of the season, and the player ran 13K, they achieved 600 meters of zone 6, then I would pick that because that's their highest zone 6 output. Obviously, the metrics do fluctuate because they're not going to achieve one giant output, but I try to be specific with, okay, what am I trying to achieve? What's the injury? What's going to benefit the athlete by? Which metrics are going to benefit the athlete when they're returning, essentially.
So if someone's achieved 600, like you say, zone 6 in that across them 90 minutes, in terms of a density, figuring out the density, you've got a session for half an hour with this guy.
Yeah.
How do you then kind of cross-reference that to make sure you're not doing 600 in the half hour, but his actual match is 600 in 90 minutes with a 15-minute break in? Like, how do you piece all that together to make sure you're not going over the top or, same again, undercooking it?
Yeah, so I would get that. I would get their average, say their average match output, and I know that their biggest game once was 600 meters of zone 6. So I would break their output down into percentiles. So 10, 20, 30, 40%, up to 100% of their zone 6. And then I can program sessions utilizing, okay, we're going to work 10% of his zone 6 today. Tomorrow he's going to come down, and the next day is going to go up to 20% or 25% of his zone 6. So you know that you're not necessarily overcooking him because the increments are small enough to allow him to progress and progressively overload safely, but you also know that you're not undercooking because he's been able to achieve that before. So in theory, he should be fine. Yeah.
Have you had any scenarios where the objective markers you're pushing this guy, you've identified that he's one you can, that he's either got re-injured or
No.
okay,
Yeah.
good work, or maybe the things haven't progressed as quick in terms of the objectivity that you want and you've had to rethink? If so, what was the process? How did the process change from there?
Yeah, so the answer is no to the re-injuries, like I said. I think it's been relevant to a quad once. He was progressing well, but in the gym, he couldn't quite achieve a reverse lunge. And so it was a little bit, it wasn't necessarily a setback, but it was he just didn't feel confident, didn't feel like he could produce force, or it just wasn't comfortable with the movement. So which we then regress the exercise. We know that we're not at the stage whereby we can start pushing this guy anymore. Regress the exercise, regress what he's doing on the pitch, take a step back, program maybe a split squat, and then we can move up once we know we're happy, he's recovered, and we can then start to push on really. So it's about just sort of getting feedback from the athlete, recognizing where you are, and sort of progressing or regressing based on that really.
In terms of the gym stuff and marrying that up with what you do on the field, how much info are you getting from your guy that's based in the gym, and what are you doing to react off that to what goes on the pitch?
Yeah. So it's just communication is key. It's if they know that, or I know, once they've achieved all of their return to run markers, they're going to start straight line running, building capacity through their hamstrings, not necessarily touching zone 5 or high speed running, but at a stage whereby he's accumulating high volumes of load, straight line running, curve running, whatever he's doing on the pitch. I can then go back after a few days and say, look, he's achieved 60% of his average match output on the pitch in terms of straight line running and volume. This guy's going to start being exposed to high speed running next session or in 2 sessions time. We need to start progressing on the pitch or in the gym. The pitch takes the priority, as selfish as that sounds coming from me, but it's that you're returning them to what their job is. So what happens on the pitch the gym has to follow that, especially if they are moving quicker on the pitch. The gym staff does kind of need to support that. If they can't, like I said, if they can't achieve the objectivity in the gym, they have to be held on the pitch. I can't take them anymore, but I will be pushing for them to start achieving more and more on the pitch.
Do you get them doing something on the pitch in the first couple of days?
I mean, as soon as they are ready and they've achieved their markers to go outside, we take them outside.
What would that be, just to get them outside doing something?
Yeah, so we program a hamstring hold.
Yeah.
With 30% of their percent of their body weight essentially for 15 seconds. We also have if it's a hamstring, we'll have like a 90-90 push, 90-90 hamstring push, and also a claw position on the Kangatech. Previously, we've used a endurance capacity test, a hamstring bridge at 90, both long lever and short lever. We tend not to use that anymore, just because strength markers for us are more important. But that would essentially grant them access to go outside.
And what does that first session look like with you?
That first session will be 100% of their MAS, straight line running, probably programmed at about 30% of their match output, in sort of walk jog intervals, progressing to longer intervals. I'm quite fluid with the way that I work on the pitch, so if I know they are happy with a movement, I might progress them, I might not. I also get the ball out early. Not only does that maintain engagement for them, because straight line running can be boring, but also it introduces reactive work early. If you think everyday movements, they're not all pre-planned. They're not all closed skills. They they do have to react. They have to move. They have to move offline. So there's no reason why that can't be achieved early on. If the constraints are there and the sort of pitch dimensions is controlled, that starts early.
So objectivity on the pitch to get them back into training of some sort with a group. Have you got any markers that you need to hit to get them transition back in?
Yeah, it's hard because in a world where, like I said, player availability is massive, as soon as they are seen on the pitch by coaches or managers, they want them, which is natural, but that makes my job so much harder because I need them, especially with a hamstring, zone 6 exposure or 90 to 100% of their max speed exposure are both key markers that I want them to achieve. Ideally, over 80% of their zone 6 volume and over 90% of their max speed are key markers that I look at. But that doesn't always happen based on what I just touched on in terms of wanting players, but yeah.
Do you continue to be involved when they have transitioned back? And if so, how? Why?
Yeah. So as they've returned, I keep a log of what they've achieved in training during games for up to 2 weeks, just so it acts as a visual aid for me to see their chronic load over throughout the whole rehab process and the additional 2 weeks that they're in training, so I can see whether they've got spikes or they haven't been loaded enough in terms of their zone 6 exposure. And then once that 2 weeks is over, it does get passed to sort of sports science and S&C for normal programs.
And one last question for you. Can you get more aggressive? Will you get more aggressive? How do you get more aggressive to get these players back quicker and fitter than you have before?
I think how aggressive is aggressive enough is the question. You're always going to want to push harder and return players back quicker. As I touched on, you can only push as hard as the body's going to let you. So the answer is yes and no. Yes, because we want to win games and we want the players to come back quicker and want them to get back to playing. But no, because it does carry risks, and sometimes their bodies may not let them. So,
Class. Thanks, mate. Anyone that wants to get in touch with you, have a little chat about this or anything else, where's the best place to go?
Yeah.
Social media guy?
Yeah, my Twitter is just my name with a 21 at the end.
Yeah, because you're 21.
Yeah, plus 21. My Instagram's similar.
Yeah.
I mainly use those two, really.
Nice. As a former gymnast, what's your ball strike like?
Any players listening to this will think
it's stinking.
think it's stinky, but I actually got given the most improved player award.
Oh,
so
nice.
I'll take that.
Good.
Yeah.
Nice. Right, mate. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it and look forward to getting this this article out there so people
Legend.
can have a read and dive into this area a bit more.
Yeah, top. No, I really appreciate coming on.
Cheers, Luke. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, mate.
Bye, mate.